Hello, everyone. We've been working our way through Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and so far we discussed the role of reason or the pursuit of wisdom in the happy life. We've talked about the role of virtue in developing your character, and last time we talked about the role of friendship in the happy life and what it takes to be true friends and why that might be necessary for living a truly happy life. The next thing I want to talk about, and the one thing I want to talk about in this video, is the role of pleasure in the happy life, in the full, complete, fulfilling life of a human being. We've seen Aristotle say a few things about pleasure already. In Book 1, he considered this way of living your life, way of pursuing happiness called the life of indulgence, which took pleasure, or the good feelings, to be the most important thing, the key to happiness. And we saw that he rejected this one because he thinks that it doesn't respect what makes us unique. He thinks that the life of pleasure is available to other creatures. And so we're capable of more, and so that one isn't likely to make us fully happy. We also saw in his discussion of virtue an important role for pleasure to play. He said that in order to have a moral virtue, you have to practice certain things until they become almost second nature. You're disposed to act in a way, in an easier way, a more sort of straightforward way than you would have before. But he also thinks that just conditioning your dispositions is not enough. In order to have a moral virtue, you also have to condition your tastes and preferences, right? Remember our case of Bobby and Susie. Bobby and Susie are both disposed to eat the salad and the broccoli for lunch at the Crow's Nest, but the difference is that Bobby doesn't yet enjoy it. He still really just wants the pizza and the ice cream, whereas Susie has grown to appreciate the salad and really loves broccoli now. Didn't before, but does now. According to Aristotle, only Susie has the moral virtue of temperance. Bobby doesn't quite yet have it. He's still missing something. And so he thinks that pleasure is really important for completing, in a way, the virtuous act. Last time we also saw that there is a kind of friendship that's based on pleasure, in which the reason why you're willing the good or loving the other person is because they are pleasant to be around. He recognizes that as a legitimate kind of friendship, but he also recognizes that it's not the deepest kind of friendship that you can form. So those are maybe some of the lessons about the role of pleasure that we've already learned. What Aristotle does in the beginning of Book 10 is he's going to take a step back and give us a larger overview of what he thinks the role of pleasure is in the happy life. And the first thing he does is he distinguishes between three main views that you could have on this issue. Remember, the question is, what is the role of pleasure? What role should pleasure play in the happy life? And there are three main views. And once again, I'm following the notes here. You should be following along in the notes. The first view is that pleasure is the good. It is the key to happiness. It is the most important thing. What role does it play in the happy life? It is the star of the show. The second view is that pleasure is no good. It should play no role, and in fact, it might even interfere with a true kind of happiness. The third view is somewhere in the middle. It says that pleasure is a good, but not the good. In other words, pleasure has some important role to play, but it can't be the most important thing. It isn't going to be the star of the show. It isn't the key to happiness. So there are roughly three sorts of views that Aristotle recognizes. And he seems to give a name for different philosophers that hold different views. And indeed, later on in the history of philosophy, you'll see plenty of other philosophers who hold each of these views. We'll see that Aristotle ultimately wants to argue in good Aristotelian fashion, according to the principle of the mean. He wants to argue for somewhere in the middle. In other words, he wants view number 3. He wants pleasure to be a good by a role, but it's not going to be the key good in accomplishing happiness for a human being. Now, so he's formulated the question. He's distinguished between the three main views on this. And now he wants to consider various arguments for and against each of these views to figure out which one is the right one. He's not just going to say, here's what I view. He's a philosopher. He's going to give arguments. He's going to give pros and cons, or arguments in favor or against each of the views, in order to be able to argue persuasively that his view, the third one, is the right view. So I want to talk about arguments that he considers in favor of 1, arguments he considers in favor of 2, and arguments he considers in favor of 3. Now, once again, he doesn't buy all of these arguments. He thinks the arguments in favor of 1 and 2 can ultimately be responded to, but he wants to introduce them because he thinks, look, these aren't stupid views. Smart people have held these views and continue to hold these views, and they have some good reasons for the view. And so if we wanted to defend the third view, we'd have to come up with some way to respond to these sorts of arguments. So let me talk about arguments in favor of the first position, that pleasure is the good. Here's one reason to think that pleasure is the good, the key to happiness, is that all things by nature seek pleasure. You might think, right, maybe there's some sort of evolutionary story about how we are pleasure-seeking missiles, right? We're already pre-programmed to pursue pleasure. We are, or this is already how we make all of our decisions. We can identify maybe more sophisticated pleasures and more sophisticated and complicated ways in order to get them, right? But we're still just always seeking pleasure. Why I think that pleasure is the key good? Because we cannot act and we cannot think otherwise. This is an interesting sort of argument. The second reason, the second argument in favor of the first position, that pleasure is the good, is that pleasure seems to be chosen as an end in itself and not for the sake of something else, right? So if you imagine sort of simple pleasures, right? I enjoy watching comedies because they make me laugh. And why do you enjoy laughing? Well, because it makes me feel good. I get a good feeling when I laugh. And why do you want the good feeling? You might think that, well, that's one question too many, right? Why did I want the good feeling from laughing at the funny joke? Well, that was the end. That was what I wanted, and it wasn't for anything further. Pleasure does seem to be something like an end in itself. And indeed, that's what we're looking for as the foundation for the happy life. So maybe that shows that pleasure is the good. The third argument in favor of the first position, that pleasure is the good, is that when added to anything else, pleasure seems to make that thing better. So for imagine, right, you're working on one of your papers for me, and let's say you get a good grade on that. I turn it back to you and say, wow, you did really great on the essay, nice work. And then you say to me, Dr. S, even better, I enjoyed writing that paper. Thank you for that. Well, if that is your response, and if you're being serious about it, then what that seems to indicate is that you took pleasure in writing the essay adds to the situation. Another example, right? You go to church when you're supposed to, right? And when you come to college, it becomes your own decision about whether you come to church. And maybe you still decide of your own free will to go to church. And you think, okay, well, I'm doing my duty. I'm going to church when I'm supposed to. But even better, right? Maybe at a certain point you come to enjoy it. That maybe you miss it when you can't have it anymore, when you can't go to church anymore, and that you have a desire because you actually take some sort of joy or pleasure out of being there at church. And so maybe these are reasons to think that pleasure is the key good, because whatever is also good, it makes the situation better by adding pleasure to it. So here's another argument in favor of one, that pleasure is the good. This argument says that pain is the bad, the worst thing that there is. So the argument is something like this. Well, maybe in order to figure out what the key to happiness is, let's figure out what the worst thing is, the thing that interferes with happiness more than anything else. And maybe that's pain or suffering. Right? Maybe that's the worst thing that can happen to you, is excruciating pain or excruciating suffering. In fact, some folks would say that they'd rather die than experience sort of extreme suffering or extreme pain. So they don't even value their life more than they value the absence of pain. So the argument goes something like this. Well, pain or suffering is the worst bad, the worst thing that can happen to you. And it seems like its opposite ought to be the best, the key to living a happy life. And the opposite of pain, of course, is pleasure. So therefore, maybe that's reason to think that pleasure is the key to happiness. It is the highest good. Those are the arguments that Aristotle considers in favor of the first view, that pleasure is the good. And they're not stupid arguments. They're interesting arguments. They together offer what seems to be a pretty compelling case in favor of that position. But let's take a look at some of the arguments in favor of the second view, the complete opposite, that pleasure is no good at all, that it plays no important role in the happy life. Aristotle considers a couple arguments here. I see maybe 5 arguments. So here's the first argument in favor of 2. A pleasurable experience seems like it can be made better, say if that pleasurable experience is also accompanied by a truly fulfilling activity. But the highest, most complete good cannot be made better by anything else. The basic argument here is that, well, okay, maybe on the one hand, pleasure does seem to make a lot of things better, but it's also like, imagine a pleasurable experience, and imagine you're also taking pleasure in something that's also healthy or good or develops your wisdom or your virtue. What we've done, see, notice what we've done here is we flipped it. Instead of adding pleasure to something else and making it better, we've taken a pleasurable experience and added something else and made it better. But if we can make pleasure better, if we can make a situation that involves pleasure better than just involving the pleasure, then pleasure isn't the most complete good. It isn't the highest good. It isn't the key to happiness. So that's an argument against thinking that pleasure plays the role that the first view says it does. Here's another argument against the claim that pleasure has to be the key to happiness. This is in favor of the view that pleasure is no good, is that some pleasurable experiences are evil. All right, so there's a possibility of some pleasures themselves being bad. What do I mean by that? Is something like this, right? Sometimes taking pleasure in a particular act makes the situation worse, not better. Here's an example, right? You find out, right? Here's sort of a grisly sort of case. What you've got is a serial killer who's, I don't know, torturing young women and killing them. You think, wow, that's terrible. That is one of the worst things I can think of. But then you hear later on, right, maybe at the trial or something like that, he says, yes, I did it, and it felt good doing it. I enjoyed it. Your reaction to that is probably not, oh, well, at least he enjoyed it. Maybe not as quite as bad as it could have been. No, I think your reaction is the fact that he enjoyed it, the fact that he took pleasure in torturing and killing those young girls makes it even worse. And so what this seems to indicate is that there are indeed evil pleasures. There are pleasures such that when you add them to the situation, it makes the situation worse, not better. There are some pleasures that are just bad to have. The third argument in favor of the view that pleasure is no good is not the phenomenon of evil pleasures, but illusory pleasures or false pleasures. Right? Some pleasurable experiences are false. For example, right? Imagine this. You're in a relationship with somebody else and you're feeling really good about it. You think that person really likes you, and then they break off the relationship and you find out later that they never actually really liked you or appreciated you. They were just in it for some other reason, right? That person was just in a relationship with you, I don't know, to get closer to your brother or something despicable like that. And your reaction to that is probably not that, oh, well, at least I took some pleasure in thinking that he or she liked me, right? But I think actually our reaction is something like, oh, I feel icky for taking pleasure, for even feeling good about that. It was a lie. It was bad that I took pleasure in a lie. Doesn't make it sort of less bad that I took pleasure in this false situation. It's worse. And so what we've got are both evil pleasures and false pleasures, which seem to indicate that pleasures can indeed be bad, can make situations worse rather than better. Let me move on to some of the other arguments in favor of the second view, that pleasure is no good. The fourth argument is that we seem to choose many things for their own sake, even when there is no pleasure associated with them. So can you think of anything that you would choose for its own sake, not just instrumentally, but for its own sake, even if there was no pleasure attached to it? I can think of a couple possible examples, and these are ones that students have come up with in the past. Maybe you think knowledge is like that. So maybe you just want to know the answer to a question. And sometimes, right, you might wonder, there might be situations in which you say, hey, I want to know what you were doing last night. And the other person might say, no, you don't want to know. It's going to hurt when I tell you the truth. And you might say that I know it's going to hurt. There's not going to be pleasure involved. In fact, there's going to be pain involved. But I still want to know. I still think that knowing would be good, and it is desirable. I just want to know. I want to satisfy my curiosity. I need to know the truth, even if it's not pleasurable, but painful. Other things we might choose for even when the pleasures are not there is maybe some of our relationships, as we talked about with the friendship of virtue or goodness. Even when, right, it no longer makes you feel good to be around a family member or a friend, maybe you still value that relationship. You still think it'd be worse to break off that relationship rather than bear through the difficult pain involved. So maybe there are some things that we choose for their own sake, even when there's no pleasures attached to them. And that would seem to indicate that pleasure is not the good. And the fifth argument in favor of the second view, that pleasure is no good, is that pleasures are fleeting. They are temporary. They never last very long, and they never have the same effect across several instances. That's the thing about pleasure, is that it wears out. This is why addictions are so dangerous, because in order to get the same experience, you need more and more of something, or a stronger version of it, right? So on the one hand, right, the first time, right, you watch Avengers Endgame, you think, wow, that was amazing. I took a lot of pleasure in that. But like, the 14th, 15th time you see it, right, it's still great, but it doesn't have quite the same experience. The pleasure is wearing off. But the highest good, like the key to happiness, ought to be something a bit more stable than that, something that doesn't wear off or wear out. And so pleasure seems like a bad candidate for being the key to happiness, the most important thing, the star of the show in the happy life. And so those are 5 arguments that Aristotle considers for thinking that the second view is right, that pleasure is no good. So now we've seen some pretty good arguments in favor of the view that pleasure is the good, the key to happiness, and several good arguments for thinking that pleasure is not a good, that it is not the key to happiness. So how do we resolve this? Here's where Aristotle introduces his arguments for the third view, that, well, okay, maybe the answer is that it's somewhere in between. Maybe the answer is that pleasure is a good, but not the good. Well, the first thing that Aristotle, he has more or less 2 arguments in favor of this view. The first one just says this. He says, okay, now take a look. I think the arguments that we saw in favor of the second position are all really good arguments. They seem compelling to me, he says. They give us all sorts of reasons to doubt that pleasure is the key to happiness. But look at the arguments again. What he says is, notice how none of these arguments actually shows that pleasure is no good at all. It just shows that some pleasures aren't good, or it shows that pleasure isn't the most important thing, that it isn't the highest good, that it isn't the key to happiness. He thinks that all of what the arguments in favor of 2 really show is just that pleasure is not the good. It doesn't show that it's not good at all. And so he thinks that I like all the arguments in favor of 2. I just don't think that they show what proponents of that view think they show. He thinks that someone who holds the third view can can push those arguments just as well. And so in response to all the arguments in favor of the second view, he just captures them. He just says, yeah, I like all those arguments. They just don't show what I think you show, what you think they show. His second reason, well, why think that pleasure has to play a role or is a good? And his answer to this is the one we already know. He thinks that pleasure is necessary to complete a virtuous action. He thinks that you haven't completely conditioned yourself in the full and complete way until not only are you disposed to act in the right way, but that you actually take pleasure in doing the right thing. You no longer find it difficult. He thinks that when we focus on these sorts of cases, when we look at Bobby and Susie, we'll see that, yeah, Susie does seem to have something that Bobby does not, and something valuable, and it seems to be sort of further along in the process, or to have a more complete state than Bobby does. And if that's true, that shows that pleasure does play a key role. It completes the virtuous action, the virtuous state of an individual. And so together, Aristotle thinks that this gives a pretty comprehensive case in favor of the third view, that pleasure is a good, but not the good. It's not the good for the reasons that we saw in favor of the second view. But Aristotle thinks that those arguments actually just show that pleasure is not the good. It doesn't show that it's not a good at all. And in fact, when we focus on his account of virtue, he says you'll see that pleasure does have an important role to play. It has to be in there somewhere, and the place that it has to be in there is to complete the virtue. So that's his motivation. That's his argument for why he thinks the third view, that pleasure is a good but not the good, is the right answer as opposed to the other 2. He thinks that reason can show that the other views are mistaken. But the last thing I want to talk about, something that Aristotle isn't perfectly clear about, but though there are some passages that seem to indicate that he goes in one direction rather than the other, is that the third view, right? Third view says that pleasure is a good but not the good. But I think there are actually 2 different ways of understanding what this view is saying. I think that there is one interpretation of the third view according to which pleasure is taken to be an independent good, and there's one interpretation of the third view according to which pleasure is taken to be a dependent good. Now, what's the difference between an independent good and a dependent good? Let me give you something like a definition, then I'll give you an example to try to illustrate what the difference is between these 2 sorts of goods. An independent good is something that is good all by itself, something that you can evaluate as good even if that's all that you had. It might not be, right, a complete good. That is, you might need some further things added to it, but all by itself you can recognize, oh yeah, this is good. An example of an independent good is something like roasted potatoes. Let's say that you're at home and mom is cooking up something in the kitchen, and you look and say, oh, well, Mom, what are you making? And she says, I'm making my famous roasted potatoes. She says, oh, I love your roasted potatoes. And she makes the roasted potatoes. She has you try some. It's like, oh, those are really good. But then when you get to dinner, Then when you get to dinner and she puts everything on your plate, right? And says, "Okay, dinner time, everybody. Here you go." And what you notice is on everybody's plate is nothing but the roasted potatoes. And you sort of look at her with disappointment and you think, "This is dinner, Mom?" She says, "What? Don't you like the roasted potatoes? Didn't you just say that they're really good?" I said, "Well, they are good, and I can evaluate their goodness just based on themselves. But they're not a complete good, right? I need more to get the full meal." And so the analogy is something like pleasure is like roasted potatoes on this view, is that it is something you can evaluate as good on its own, but it's not a complete meal. If that's all you have on your plate, you're still missing something. You're not going to have the full happiness that you can. You're not going to feel full, right? You're not going to have a complete meal. I actually think that this is not Aristotle's view. This is not the way that he's understanding the third view. I think that in his view, pleasure is not an independent good, but a dependent good. So it can be an independent good, but incomplete, or it can be a fully dependent good. I think actually Aristotle holds the second view, that pleasure is a dependent good. And what does it mean for a good to be dependent? It means that it's not actually good on its own or in itself. Its goodness depends on what else it is attached to or associated with. It has to be attached to some other fulfilling action or activity or other good, right? So you have to be taking pleasure in developing virtue, or you have to take pleasure in developing your mind. Maybe the phenomenon of evil or false pleasures show us that pleasure is not an independent good. Pleasures can be bad when attached to or associated with the wrong sorts of things, and they can be good when they're attached to or associated with the right kinds of things. Here's an analogy to help understand maybe what a dependent good is. If roasted potatoes are an independent good, what I want to say is that dependent goods includes things like, well, ketchup. Ketchup is a dependent good. Ketchup is great. When you have a cheeseburger and you don't have ketchup on it, it seems to be missing something. When you put the ketchup on the cheeseburger, it makes that cheeseburger better. Right? It really offers a good contribution to the cheeseburger. But here's the thing. Put ketchup on pancakes, not nearly as good. And in fact, I want to say pretty bad. Don't put ketchup on your pancakes, right? What that shows is that ketchup is good when added to the right thing. It's a dependent good, but not when you add it to the wrong thing. And indeed, ketchup isn't great when you just drink it out of the bottle. Don't try that. It's not good. I think another example of a dependent good would be something like Cool Whip. Cool Whip is good. When you add it to desserts, it makes them better most times. And it seems to add a real contribution to the goodness of that dessert. But Cool Whip is not an independent good. You can't enjoy it on the wrong sort of thing, like put your Cool Whip on your lasagna, not good. Or, right, what I want to say is eat Cool Whip on its own, not so good. Let me tell you a story about little philosopher Dr. S. Little philosopher Dr. S, his grandma makes very good Jello. My favorite is the green Jello. And she puts on the green Jello, she always puts Cool Whip on the green Jello, and she brings it to every sort of dinner we have. And little Dr. S thinks, wow, this is great. I always look forward to the green Jello with the Cool Whip. And he also reasons, he thinks, yeah, not only do I look forward to the green Jello with the Cool Whip, but the Cool Whip on that green Jello is my favorite part of the dessert. And he thinks about this, right, after a period of months in which Grandma continues to bring the Cool Whip, and he tries this, and he says, yes, I think Cool Whip is my favorite part of the dessert. And so he thinks about this, and he says, well, wait a second. What, given that Cool Whip is my favorite part of the dessert, and the dessert is the favorite part of the meal, what if I just ate the Cool Whip? So little Dr. S goes over to the fridge, he gets the tub of Cool Whip, he gets a big spoon, and he goes to town. Immediately, little Dr. S realizes that he has made a terrible error. He has made a terrible mistake in philosophical reasoning. What he realizes is that just because Cool Whip is good on the dessert, and maybe even the best part of the dessert, that does not mean that it is an independent good. It does not mean you can eat it on its own. Eating the Cool Whip out of the tub is not good. It will make you sick, and it will make you not want Cool Whip ever again. So I think that Cool Whip and ketchup are things like are dependent goods. They are good when added to the right thing, bad when added to the wrong thing, and not good on their own. And I think this is the view that Aristotle has about pleasure. Pleasure does have a really important role to play. Ketchup really does make the cheeseburger better, and it's missing something if you don't have the ketchup on it. But it isn't good on its own. Pleasure on its own is not good. You can't evaluate the goodness of a pleasure until you tell me what it's associated with. And I think there's an important lesson from this. If he's right about this, if he's right that pleasure is a dependent good, then what that means is that because it feels good is never a good enough reason to do anything. Why? Because we can't evaluate whether the good feeling that you got was good or bad until you tell us more about what that good feeling is associated with. Right? Did it feel good, right? I don't know, to push the old lady? Did it feel good to take money out of the collection basket? Did it feel good to cheat on the test? Well, now I want to say that, well, then that was a bad reason for you to do what you did. But did it feel good, right, to help the old lady cross the street? Did it feel good to donate to charity? Did it feel good to study hard and do well on your exam? Notice that when we fill out the details about what you felt good about, I think it changes dramatically whether you had a good reason, right, to do what you did. Just saying that it felt good is never a full explanation. It's never a good enough reason, because pleasure is always a dependent good. Whether it even is a reason to do anything at all depends not on the pleasure itself, but on what you're taking pleasure in. I think that's an important lesson here. And this is his ultimate answer, I think, to the role of pleasure in the happy life. It plays a role, but you have to be very careful about pleasure. It's only good when it's attached to something else truly fulfilling, like developing your mind or your character or your relationships, your friendships. On its own, it's not good, and when attached to the wrong sort of thing, it's even bad. And so we have to pay careful attention to the way in which pleasure is sort of motivating or our actions or present in our own lives, because you have to be careful. We can use pleasure wrongly, we can perceive pleasure wrongly, and we can pursue it for the wrong reasons. We can have the wrong idea about what is good about pleasure. We don't have to have the view that pleasure is bad. We just have to have the proper understanding of what its goodness consists in and in what contexts it is good. So that's Aristotle's account of pleasure. Next time what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about, finally, we're going to get an answer from Aristotle about what sort of life is the best sort of life that human beings can live. In book 1, we got his definition of happiness, but we still don't know exactly what a life that fulfills that definition really looks like. The second half of book 10 is really where he answers this question. So that's what we'll do next time.